At the edge of an old, forgotten town stood the remnants of a once grand theater, now reduced to crumbling brick and rotting wood. The Bellamy Theater had been the pride of the town for years, famous for its mesmerizing marionette performances, where puppets danced and moved so gracefully they seemed almost human. But no one had stepped foot inside for decades, not since the night of the final performance. No one liked to talk about what happened that night. The rumors, however, had a way of sticking around. Some said it was an accident. Others spoke of something far darker. But one thing was certain: whatever had occurred inside that theater had cursed it, and the town never recovered. People left, businesses closed, and the once thriving community faded into obscurity. Years later, a young couple, Tom and Rachel, looking for a fresh start, purchased the theater. They had no interest in its dark past. To them, it was an investment opportunity, a chance to restore the grand old building and bring it back to life as a historic landmark. They arrived in the late afternoon, their car crunching over the gravel driveway. The theater loomed ahead, its silhouette casting long shadows in the fading light. Despite its decay, the building still exuded an eerie elegance, as though the ghosts of its past performances lingered just beneath the surface. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the scent of mildew. The seats were torn, their red velvet upholstery faded to brown. The stage, where countless puppets had once danced, stood silent, its curtains moth-eaten and hanging in shreds. Tom was excited, eager to begin the restoration, but Rachel felt a chill crawl up her spine the moment they stepped through the door. The feeling only grew as they explored deeper into the theater. Upstairs, they found the old dressing rooms, the mirrors cracked and spotted with age. Below the stage, they discovered a sprawling network of tunnels and storage rooms, filled with old props and forgotten pieces of the theater's history. It was in one of these rooms that they found the marionettes. Dozens of them, suspended from the ceiling by strings, their wooden limbs hanging limp. Some were small and delicate, with faces painted in soft pastels, while others were larger, more grotesque, their features exaggerated and strange. But they all shared the same eerie stillness, as though they were waiting for something, or someone, to bring them to life again. One marionette stood out from the rest. It was larger than the others, nearly life-sized, with a porcelain face and pale, glassy eyes that seemed to stare straight through anyone who looked at it. Its body was dressed in a tattered, elegant costume, the faded remnants of a performer's outfit. Something about it unnerved Rachel, but Tom was fascinated. As the days passed, they began the restoration in earnest. The theater came to life in small ways, the dust was swept, the broken seats repaired, the crumbling walls patched. Yet, no matter how much work they did, the place never felt right. There was a heaviness in the air, a sense of something lurking just beyond their sight. And then there were the marionettes. Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that they were watching her. She would catch glimpses of them out of the corner of her eye, heads turning slightly, eyes following her as she moved through the room. At first, she told herself it was just her imagination, the result of spending too much time in the dimly lit, oppressive atmosphere of the old theater. But the feeling only grew stronger. One night, after a long day of repairs, Tom and Rachel decided to head home. As they walked out of the theater, Rachel glanced back, her eyes drawn to the stage. The large marionette, the one with the porcelain face, was standing at the edge of the stage, its arms raised as though it had been in the middle of a performance. Rachel froze, her blood running cold. She was sure they had left it in the storage room below the stage. She stared at the marionette, waiting for some rational explanation to reveal itself. But the figure stood motionless, its glassy eyes reflecting the faint glow of the stage lights. That night, Rachel couldn't sleep. She lay awake, her mind replaying the image of the marionette on the stage. She could hear the creaks and groans of the old theater echoing in her thoughts, the sense of being watched never quite leaving her. The next day, Tom seemed unaffected, but Rachel was beginning to unravel. As she walked through the theater, the feeling of eyes on her was stronger than ever. She tried to avoid the storage rooms where the marionettes hung, but they seemed to seep into every corner of the theater. That evening, as they prepared to leave, the power in the building suddenly went out. Darkness swallowed the theater whole, leaving only the faintest slivers of moonlight filtering through the broken windows. Tom cursed, fumbling for a flashlight. But Rachel, she froze. From the stage, she heard it, a faint creaking, like wood bending and strings tightening. Her heart pounded in her chest as she turned toward the sound. The large marionette was no longer on the stage. It stood at the bottom of the steps, its head tilted unnaturally to the side, its arms reaching forward as if grasping for something. Or someone. Rachel backed away, her breath quickening. The beam from Tom's flashlight swept across the theater, catching glimpses of other marionettes, some in the aisles, others perched on seats or hanging from the walls. They were all moving, their heads turning, their bodies shifting, strings tightening and loosening as though manipulated by invisible hands. Tom shouted, trying to figure out what was happening, but his voice was drowned out by the growing cacophony of creaks and snaps. The marionettes were moving faster now, their lifeless limbs jerking and twisting in grotesque imitation of life. Rachel felt something brush against her ankle. She looked down to see one of the smaller marionettes dragging itself across the floor toward her, its wooden fingers grasping at her leg. Panic surged through her. She screamed, scrambling to get away, but the marionettes were closing in, their movements faster, more erratic, their eyes gleaming in the dark. One by one, they surrounded Tom and Rachel, their strings tangling and twisting around them. In the chaos, Rachel stumbled, falling to the floor as the marionettes swarmed over her, their cold wooden hands pulling at her clothes, their faces expressionless yet filled with a silent malice. She could hear Tom struggling behind her, but the sound grew fainter as the marionettes dragged him away, deeper into the theater's labyrinth of darkness. Rachel tried to scream, but the strings wound tighter, cutting into her skin, pulling her limbs in unnatural directions. She was helpless, her body no longer her own, her movements controlled by the unseen puppeteers that had taken over the theater. In the dim light, she caught one final glimpse of the large marionette standing over her, its glassy eyes reflecting her terror. Its strings twitched, and for a brief, horrifying moment, Rachel realized it wasn't just a puppet. It was watching her. And then, everything went black. When the townspeople finally grew curious enough to investigate the Bellamy Theater months later, they found it as they had always remembered, quiet, decaying, untouched. But on the stage, set perfectly in the center, were two new marionettes. They were life-sized, with porcelain faces and painted eyes that gleamed unnervingly in the faint light. And if you looked closely, you could almost swear they moved.